The Texas sun shimmered like molten brass over a horizon that never seemed to end. Heat rose from the tracks in trembling waves as a long, dust-covered train groaned to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The metal hissed like an angry serpent. Inside the boxcars, behind narrow wooden slats, faces pressed against the gaps. Tired, hollow-eyed faces belonging to men who no longer believed in miracles. They were soldiers once, now prisoners. Germans captured in Africa, shipped across an ocean they never thought they'd see, and now standing at the edge of a land that looked like another planet. When the doors creaked open, the glare hit them like a blow. The prisoners squinted, blinking at the strange emptiness before them. No barbed wire, no barking guards, no angry crowds, just the wide silence of open plains, grass whispering in the wind, cicadas buzzing in the heat, and far off, a few horses standing still as statues. The men shifted uneasily, expecting rifles, commands, humiliation. Instead, they saw cowboys, real ones, wearing wide-brimmed hats and dusty boots, sitting astride their horses like figures from another century. For a long moment, no one moved. A crow called somewhere, and its echo stretched thin over the prairie. Then, an American officer stepped forward. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He simply gestured for them to step down, one by one, into the sunlit dirt. The prisoners obeyed, moving stiffly, their boots sinking into the soft earth. The ground smelled of hay and heat, and something unsettlingly gentle. They looked around in disbelief. No fortress walls, no machine guns. Only a few wooden barracks in the distance, their roofs glinting faintly under the sky. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. One prisoner whispered, "Where are the fences?" Another muttered, "They'll come later." But the fences never did. The cowboys watched quietly, their faces unreadable beneath their hats. One of them, tall and sunburned, spat into the dust and said, "Ain't no use running out here. You'll just get lost in the wind." His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, as if explaining the rules of nature itself. The Germans nodded, uncertain whether it was a warning or a kindness. The train behind them exhaled steam, moaning like a dying animal. For many, it sounded like the last breath of the old world, the one of orders, flags, and fury. Before them lay something else entirely. As the line of prisoners began to march toward their new camp, a strange realization crept through them. The sky stretched endlessly above, the grass rolled like green waves below, and in between stood men who didn't seem to hate them. It was the kind of confusion that frightened more than cruelty ever could. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the train was gone, leaving only silence and footprints in the dust. The prisoners looked around their strange new prison, and one thought echoed in every mind. This doesn't feel like captivity. But they didn't yet know, this land would change them, and by the time they left, they would no longer be the same men who had arrived in those wooden boxcars. Morning crept over the plains like a slow-burning fire. The prisoners awoke to a sound they hadn't heard in years, roosters crowing, not sirens or gunfire. A thin mist hung over the fields, glowing gold as the sun climbed higher. From their barracks, the Germans could see the camp clearly now. It wasn't the grim compound they'd imagined. A few wooden fences, a handful of watchtowers that looked almost decorative, and beyond them, acres of farmland stretching into forever. The air smelled of dust, grass, and freedom. They were marched through the gates, expecting orders barked in English they wouldn't understand. But instead, an American guard simply pointed toward a water trough and said, "Drink if you're thirsty." The words were plain, almost kind. One man hesitated, unsure if it was a trick, until another stepped forward and cupped his hands in the cool water. The guard didn't stop him. a small act, meaningless in any other world, but here, it shattered something inside them. Fear began to melt, replaced by a quiet, wary curiosity. All around, the Texas landscape seemed alive with indifference. Cattle grazed beyond the fences, windmill blades creaked lazily in the distance, and bluebonnets, fields of them, spread across the hills like spilled paint. The Germans had never seen such color. It was a place that didn't belong to war, yet here they were, war's castaways, standing ankle-deep in its beauty. As they settled in, they began to notice things that didn't fit the idea of enemy territory. A farmer's wife bringing bread to the guards and smiling shyly at them through the fence. Children waving from the back of a wagon. A local rancher tipping his hat as he rode past. These moments didn't make sense. Back home, they'd been told Americans were monsters, arrogant, brutal, inhuman. But here, even the sun seemed to treat them gently. That night, when the camp lights flickered on, one prisoner whispered, "Maybe they've forgotten we're the enemy." Another replied, "Or maybe they never saw us that way." The thought lingered in the quiet, more dangerous and disarming than any weapon. Days passed. The guards weren't cruel. They were watchful, yes, but not hateful. They called the prisoners boys, not krauts. They let them walk the perimeter, breathe the open air, look up at the stars. Slowly, a strange peace settled over the camp. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was something that felt dangerously close. As the wind swept through the bluebonnets outside the fence, the men began to realize the truth. They were captives, yes, but of kindness, not chains. And that, somehow, was harder to understand than any prison of steel. The first day of work began before dawn. The Texas sky was still a deep indigo, the stars fading as if reluctant to leave. The German prisoners gathered near the gate, their breath visible in the early chill. They were handed tools, not rifles, shovels, hose, rope. One guard, a tall man named Cooper with a sunburned neck and a voice like gravel, told them simply, "We're fixin' fences today. Keep up, and we'll get along just fine." Then he mounted his horse and rode ahead, his silhouette cutting against the rising sun. At first, the prisoners moved mechanically, digging, hauling, repairing broken posts along the endless barbed wire. They worked in silence, every muscle still wired with suspicion. But Texas had a way of breaking silence. The wind whistled through the mesquite trees, the cows bellowed lazily, and somewhere, a radio from a guard's truck played faint country music. It wasn't long before rhythm replaced tension, and the day unfolded like an uneasy truce. By noon, sweat soaked their uniforms. The guards offered water and shade. One of them, barely 20, freckles across his face, shared a tin cup with a prisoner named Ernst. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. An unspoken acknowledgement. Men working under the same sun are not so different after all. Days turned into weeks. The men were sent to pick cotton, repair barns, tend to cattle. At first, they saw it as punishment. But slowly, the work began to mean something more. The soil was rough, stubborn, yet when they pushed a plow through it, it yielded. It gave back. Much like the men themselves, it resisted at first, then softened under steady hands. The guards, many of them ranchers before the war, taught the prisoners things they never expected to learn: how to mend saddles, throw a lasso, calm a frightened horse. Cooper once handed a prisoner named Lucas the reins of his mare and said, "You fall off, you get back up." That's the cowboy way. Lucas did fall, hard, but when he stood again, covered in dust and laughter, something inside him shifted. The Americans laughed too, not cruelly, but like brothers watching one of their own learn to walk again. Soon, laughter became common. The camp echoed with it during breaks, the boundaries between guard and prisoner blurring like heat on the horizon. Some evenings, they gathered near the fence to watch the cowboys practice their roping tricks. The prisoners clapped and cheered, their cheers met with friendly grins. Once, a sergeant even tossed a rope through the wire and said, "Let's see if the Krauts can beat Texas hands." To everyone's surprise, one did, and the cheers that followed were genuine on both sides. Through labor and sweat, a strange kinship grew. They were still on opposite sides of a war, but here, under this endless sky, that war felt like a distant rumor. The cowboy code, honor, respect, hard work, became their new law. It replaced the rigid obedience they'd been raised in with something freer, more human. One night, as Lucas sat by the barracks fence, he watched the Americans tending to their horses under the moonlight. Their laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the chirp of crickets. He thought of the officers who told them America was cruel, and for the first time, he realized how wrong they'd been. These men weren't enemies. They were simply men who loved their land, their horses, and the simple dignity of a hard day's work. As the stars burned bright over Texas, Lucas whispered to himself, "Maybe the war doesn't matter here." And in that whisper, the first seeds of peace began to take root, quietly, invisibly, like grass growing through the cracks of an old battlefield. Night settled gently over the camp, the Texas air cooling after another long, golden day. The barracks glowed dimly from inside, thin bulbs swaying slightly from the ceiling, casting shadows that breathed across wooden walls. The men sat on their bunks, boots off, shirts damp with the scent of work and sun. On the table in the center lay a stack of envelopes, freshly delivered. Each one bore strange American stamps, their edges worn from travel across an ocean of uncertainty. Names were called one by one. Some men stepped forward eagerly, others hesitated, afraid of what words might be waiting inside. Ernst unfolded his letter slowly, his hands trembling. The handwriting was his mother's. He read about ration lines in Hamburg, about bombings that shook their street, about a neighbor's son who hadn't returned. Her words were tender, but they carried the heavy silence of things she couldn't say. Across the room, Lucas sat quietly, his eyes tracing the censor's black lines drawn across his wife's sentences. Whole emotions, erased by ink. He smiled faintly anyway. Just seeing her name was enough to make the barracks fade for a moment, to make him feel human again. A few men laughed, remembering old jokes, pretending the world outside still had room for laughter. Others turned away, shoulders shaking quietly. No one mocked them. Even the guards standing at the door pretended not to notice. Outside, the Americans sat by a small fire, listening to the radio. A voice crackled from the speaker, announcing fresh battles in Italy, in France, in the Pacific. The guards fell silent. They were thousands of miles from home too, brothers still out there fighting, families waiting just as anxiously. In that soft orange light, it was impossible to tell who the prisoners really were. The night deepened. Some men folded their letters carefully, tucking them into pockets like fragile treasures. Others stared at the dark ceiling, their minds wandering across oceans. In that stillness, a strange understanding settled over the camp. They were all just men suspended between two worlds, the war that had shaped them, and the quiet mercy that was slowly undoing them. And as the crickets sang beyond the wire, the distance between enemies shrank to almost nothing. The morning began like any other, sunlight spilling across the plains, dust rising from boots, and the faint clang of the mess hall bell. But that day, something different stirred in the air. The guards were restless, smiling in ways the prisoners couldn't quite read. When the gates opened, the men braced for orders, perhaps another day of labor under the burning sun. Instead, Cooper, the tall cowboy guard with the gravel voice, rode forward and said, Mount up, boys. Today we're heading out. The Germans exchanged glances. Mount up? None of them moved. Cooper grinned. You're gonna ride today, he said, jerking his thumb toward a corral filled with saddled horses, their manes glinting like spun copper in the light. The air thickened with disbelief. Horses? For prisoners? It felt absurd, like a dream dreamt by men too long denied joy. Soon, with the help of the cowboys, they began to climb awkwardly into the saddles. The horses shifted, snorted, testing their uncertain riders. There were laughs, shouts, near falls. One man cursed in German as his horse took a sudden step sideways. Another managed to steady himself and raised his arms in triumph, drawing cheers from both sides of the wire. For the first time, the camp's fences didn't look like barriers, they looked like background. Then, the gates swung open. Slowly, cautiously, they rode out. Beyond the camp lay miles of open pasture, golden grass rippling under a wide blue sky. The Texans led the way, guiding them through the hills, showing them how to steer, how to feel the animal beneath them. The wind tore through their hair, the scent of earth and sage filling their lungs. Laughter began to rise, laughter that had been buried under years of war and loss. Cooper called back, "Reckon y'all can rope?" And before anyone could answer, he tossed a lasso through the air, catching a post clean. The Germans tried next, fumbling at first, then cheering when one of them, Lucas, managed to loop a fence rail. The cowboys whooped, clapping him on the back. In that sun-drenched field, enemies became companions, their laughter echoing off the endless horizon. Someone produced a harmonica. Another, from the guard's pack, a flask of water passed between hands without hesitation. Time dissolved. For a few golden hours, there was no war, no sides, only men, sweat, horses, and the boundless sky. When one of the horses broke free, kicking up dust, two Germans and a cowboy chased it together, their shouts mixing until no one could tell who was American and who was not. When they caught it, breathless and laughing, Cooper just shook his head. "Guess y'all learned faster than I thought." As the sun began to dip, painting the land in amber light, they turned back toward the camp. The fences came into view again, but now they seemed smaller, less like walls, more like lines drawn in sand. Lucas looked around at the men beside him, their faces glowing with sweat and joy, and thought, "This is what freedom feels like." When they reached the gate, no one spoke. The guards didn't order them inside. They simply nodded, letting the moment linger. That evening, as the stars returned to claim the sky, the sound of laughter still drifted over the plains. For once, it didn't matter whose laughter it was, it belonged to everyone who'd been brave enough to forgive, even for a day. The telegram came in the early summer of 1945. It was brief, official, and world-shaking. The war was over. The guards read it first, their faces still, eyes distant. Then the news spread through the camp like a gust through tall grass. Some prisoners cheered, others stood frozen, unsure what victory or defeat meant anymore. The end of the war felt less like celebration and more like a quiet exhale after holding one's breath for too long. Days later, trucks arrived with papers, lists, and instructions. The camp began to empty, plank by plank, fence by fence. The Germans packed their few belongings, letters, carved trinkets, small drawings of horses, and lined up by the gates that had once defined their world. Cooper was there, hat in hand, watching them with a heaviness he didn't try to hide. Lucas approached him, his duffel slung over his shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lucas extended his hand. Cooper looked at it, then took it firmly. "Didn't figure I'd miss y'all," Cooper said quietly. Lucas smiled. "Nor I. This place." The two men stood for a heartbeat longer, the wind tugging at their shirts, before stepping back into their separate worlds. When the convoy finally rolled away, dust trailed behind like smoke from a dying fire. The prisoners turned in their seats, watching the camp recede into the horizon, the barracks, the corrals, the waving grass. Some wiped their eyes. Others whispered soft farewells to the land that had shown them a different kind of strength. For the Texans, it was no easier. They dismantled the guard towers, stacked the wood, and led the horses back to their ranches. But something of the prisoners lingered, in the laughter that sometimes echoed over the fields, in the quiet respect that settled over the men who had once worn uniforms on opposite sides of a world's madness. Months later, when the rains came, wildflowers bloomed where the fences had stood. Bluebonnets and sunflowers, bright against the dark soil, as if nature itself refused to remember barbed wire. Cooper would ride past those fields sometimes, pausing to look at the horizon. He swore the wind still carried voices, German, English, laughter blending into one. And perhaps it did. For even when the camp was gone, the memory stayed, stitched into the soil, into the sky, into every gust that swept across the Texas plains. The war had ended, yes, but the wind stayed. Decades have passed since those days when trains carried ghosts across oceans, when barbed wire met bluebonnets, and when men once sworn to destroy each other learned how to ride together beneath a Texas sky. Time has erased the camp, swallowed the wooden barracks, and scattered the fence posts back into the soil. Yet the land remembers. Every gust that sweeps across the plains carries something. Faint laughter, the echo of hooves, a melody made of memory. Old ranchers still tell the story. They say that, on quiet evenings when the light turns amber and the world holds its breath, you can almost see them. Two riders, one in a cowboy hat, the other in a worn German cap, galloping side by side through the tall grass. They don't speak, and they don't need to. The wind speaks for them, whispering through the blue bonnets that bloom where the fences once stood. No one built a monument there. No stone marks the spot. But perhaps it's better that way. The true memorial isn't carved in granite. It's living, breathing, carried in every story told by those who remember that mercy can exist even in the shadow of war. The Texans who once guarded those men grew old, their sons and grandsons inheriting the same soil, the same quiet pride. Some of the Germans returned after the war, years later, not as prisoners, but as friends. They brought their families, pointed to the open fields, and said softly, "Here. This is where we found freedom." The story endures because it isn't about victory or surrender. It's about transformation, about men who arrived bound by hatred and left bound by understanding. The camp was meant to hold them captive, yet somehow it freed them from something far greater than barbed wire, the weight of believing the world had no kindness left. When we listen closely to that Texas wind, we don't just hear the past, we hear a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, light can find its way in. That a handshake between supposed enemies can echo longer than 1,000 gunshots, and that sometimes the truest kind of freedom isn't found when the gates open, but when the heart finally does.